Hey everyone, Jared Monshine here. I am the Director of Research at the U.S. Studies Center. And before we get started, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're on today. We're on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So we are here today to discuss Taiwan's upcoming election. It is occurring next month, and we have a fantastic panel to discuss it. Folks may not know that there's at the U.S. Studies Center, we focus on more than just the U.S., and there's actually an election that's not just the one occurring in a year from now. And so I want to first flag that the Taiwanese election, we were just having a discussion before this, is one of the few elections that almost equals the U.S. level of excitement and craziness. The U.S. domestic politics are sort of one thing we're particularly known for at the U.S. Studies Center for covering. I describe it as the soap opera with endless episodes because it never stops being fun and entertaining. And Taiwan, up until very recently, we didn't even know who was going to be on the tickets. It is such an exciting election. So the contest to succeed the current term limited president has already seen unprecedented drama in some ways. There are four candidates vying for Taiwan's highest office. And at one stage, two of them were mulling a joint bid to unseat the ruling DPP government. And the frontrunner and current vice president, his views on independence have been a bit controversial at times in the past, or at least a source of much discussion. And so we also know the significant tensions in the Taiwan Strait and some belligerent rhetoric from Beijing. So the results of this election, despite us being the U.S. Studies Center and thinking that the U.S. election matters a lot, the results of this election next month are actually pretty significant. And I'm going to have, as I said, a fantastic panel joining us shortly. But before I introduce them, I want to introduce Taiwan's representative to Australia, Douglas Hsu. He was previously Director General of North American Affairs within Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and served in the political and congressional liaison divisions of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office in the United States. He not only knows the U.S. and how fun our politics are, he also knows his own countries as well. So with that, I'll let him make some opening remarks, and then after that, I will start our panel discussion.
Well, thank you. Dr. Green, Dr. Lee, Richard, and Jared, and all the friends here tonight, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. First of all, I would like to thank USSC for inviting me to speak at today's event. As Taiwan is officially entering the campaign season, there are more and more discussion about this topic. Well, today's event, I think, is the very first seminar in Australia that focus on this Taiwan's upcoming elections. So it is truly a pleasure for me to join all of you and to learn about your views and analysis about our elections, as well as the implication to Australia-Taiwan partnership and to the overall Indo-Pacific region. Well, in fact, I was just returned to Australia less than a week ago from a visit to Taipei. Well, even it is now still more than a month before our election day. The campaign activities are intensely undergoing in Taiwan. And when I was in Taipei, I already closely observed some political drama. I stayed at the Grand Hyatt Hotel, where the opposition party candidates, they got together for the last time to make effort of forming a coalition on a ticket. And then they had a very interesting press conference after a possible collaboration falling apart. So I believe we'll see more drama of this kind happen in the months to go. However, on the other hand, my government is also watching very closely about foreign interference that try to influence the election outcome, no matter they're through the spreading of the misinformation, disinformation, or conspiracies. We, however, will ensure the election, both the presidential election as well as the legislative election, will be conducted on the basis of fairness and transparency as always. Here in Australia, I think our discussion today will go beyond Taiwanese internal politics and focus more on how Taiwanese election will impact the bilateral relationship as well as the regional geopolitical dynamics. After all, Taiwan is Australia's 5th largest trading partner, and we do share a very close business tie with Australia. Especially in the past few years, when we saw the disruption of global supply chain due to the pandemic or economic coercion, we learned how important it is to work with like-minded partners to review the vulnerability and complementarities of respective business sectors during the peacetime, so that we can make sure we are resilient enough to face any future challenges. Moreover, after Australia joined the AUKUS and started to play an even more proactive role in the regional affairs, including frequently expressing the concern over the peace and stability in Taiwan Strait, actively engaging with allies and partners on the security cooperation, and pouring unprecedented amount of resources in Pacific to consolidate relation with Pacific Island states. Without a doubt, there are more reasons for Australia to pay more attention to Taiwan's upcoming elections. Therefore, I look forward to today's discussion. Finally, beyond the perspective of internal politics and regional geopolitics, as Taiwanese chief representative in Australia, I would like to bring up to your attention another perspective to look into our upcoming election, which is Taiwanese voters' perspective. This will be our 8th direct presidential election. From an authoritarian region under martial law to the beacon of democracy in Asia Pacific, it has been a long journey for Taiwan. And for Taiwanese voters, democracy is not just a value. It is our way of life. It is something that we sacrifice a lot to get it. And it is also something that is so precious that we are willing to do whatever we can and whatever we need to protect it. Therefore, Taiwanese voters' message regarding these upcoming elections is, this is our election. This is our democracy. No matter who wins the election and become our next president, he will make sure Taiwan continue to be a resilient, free, and democratic country. Taiwan will also continue to be a responsible stakeholder in the world and work with like-minded partners to maintain peace and stability and prosperities in the Indo-Pacific region. And again, I look forward to our discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. So now that was a lovely official remarks, but now we get down to the really fun and maybe less professional and formal remarks where we actually talk about the down and dirty politics of what's going on in Taiwan. So just to set the stage before I introduce the folks, there are a few candidates we're going to be talking about. You have the Democratic Progressive Party DPP candidate William Lai. He continues to lead the polls, although it's pretty close. And then you have the current president, Tsai Ing-Wen, who is term limited, so that's 8 years. She's been in office. She'll be leaving soon. And then you have the KMT candidate, Ho, and then you have the Taiwan's People Party candidate, Ko Wen-je, and they were the ones who I mentioned before about forming potentially a unity candidate, but then at the last minute fell apart. And then actually, we just had a debate in the US today, which unfortunately I haven't watched, though I heard there were some fireworks. But there's going to be a presidential debate in Taiwan on December 20 that we can look forward to. So with that, let me introduce my fantastic panel. So what we want to do with this panel is really explain how Taiwan is viewed from different perspectives. The panelists I have with me today all know Taiwan exceptionally well, but they also know the perceptions of Taiwan outside of Taiwan. So first, we have Richard McGregor, who's a senior fellow for East Asia at the Lowy Institute and a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in the US. And he's a former Beijing and Washington bureau chief for the Financial Times and the author of numerous books on East Asia. Next, we have Lavina Lee, who is a non-resident senior fellow with us at the U.S. Studies Center, as well as a senior lecturer in the Department of Security Studies and Criminology at Macquarie University, and formerly a political risk consultant with Control Risk Group. And finally, we have my boss, Mike Green. He's the CEO of the U.S. Studies Center, and he's a former member of the Bush administration's National Security Council. And he was actually part of a bipartisan U.S. delegation of former U.S. security officials to Taiwan in March of last year when he met with President Tsai and Vice President Lai and other senior officials in Taiwan. And so we have an exceptional panel today, and now I'll ask them to join me on stage. Yeah, I'll sit here if that's all right. Thank you so much. So as I said, I really am excited for this panel because, like I said, they know Taiwan, but they also know Taiwan from different perspectives. And the man closest to me is, in many ways, in my view, Australia's top expert on China. And he not only worked in China, but knows the perception of a lot of different things, including Taiwan. So I want to start with just going down. We'll go down with each, but starting with you, Richard. How is this election perceived in Beijing? As the representative said, it's been 8 elections. What does this matter to Beijing, and how has Beijing conducted itself in prior elections that Taiwan has held?
Well, the first thing to say is that every presidential election in Taiwan is important because the advent of democracy in Taiwan, centered on presidential elections, I think represents the fundamental break between China and Taiwan. So every election is important. This one is particularly important in this respect. If the DPP wins, that is essentially the anti-China party, they will have won 3 terms in a row. Now, previously we had 2 for the DPP, 2 for the KMT, 2 for the DPP, 2 for the KMT. It's been a pattern
of 8 years in a row.
8 years in a row. But in this occasion, if the DPP wins, that will mark a break with that and obviously solidify China's exceptionally dim view of theirs. Secondly, it's quite a result for the DPP because they're not that popular. They're suffering from the usual problems of a party which has been in power for a long time, the wear and tear factor and the like. And if the KMT can't beat them now, then they're probably going to struggle to beat them or win back power at any time. So the Chinese will not be happy with the DPP victory, especially for those reasons. And remember that the foundational identification with political parties in Taiwan is kind of national identity, how you identify yourself. The DPP supporters identify themselves as Taiwanese, KMT, Taiwanese, and Chinese. So it marks a further separation. So what will be the Chinese response then? I think there's undoubtedly going to be some kind of military Chinese response. Now, I'm not saying that China is going to start a war or invade or even grab one of the outlying islands or something like that. But Chinese officials or Chinese scholars have said this to me personally. They just said it in a matter-of-fact fashion a couple of weeks ago. There will be a military response. Perhaps another blockade of some kind, which of course China can do, has the capability, military capability to do exceptionally quickly. And so I think we'll see that. What will happen on top of that? Obviously, Mike's going to talk about this, but one of China's main aims is to keep the US out and away from Taiwan. Secondly, with the blockade, I think they want to exhibit US impotence to do anything about it. That's very important to make the US look like it's losing its power, losing its grip. I think that you will see an extension of the kind of pressure we see China applying around the world to isolate Taiwan further, to make sure that sticks. That applies to Japan, South Korea, Germany, Australia, anywhere you think about. We'll go through this another sort of, this is the wrong way, President Kabuki play about China demanding that the DPP support the One China policy. That is in terms of code, by the way, something called the 1992 consensus. I'm not going to try and explain that here. And in fact, if you want to have a good party trick, get somebody to try and explain the 1992 consensus when they're drunk after dinner, because it doesn't fit it. You know, wasn't in 1992, and it's not a consensus.
Sounds like you have some experience with this, Richard.
Yeah, no, I can do it. So China's I shouldn't go on too much longer, but China's approach is pretty interesting this election. The last election, Tsai Ing-Wen was not popular beforehand, but Xi Jinping made a speech about how the Hong Kong one country, two systems would apply to Taiwan, and this backfired spectacularly, and I think helped get her re-elected. This time, I think, and somebody might correct me, I think Xi has been quieter. China's using a variety of techniques. They've been flying hundreds or about 1,000 local officials in Taiwan to China and their families to try and build up grassroots support. They've been using the stick. You know, they banned Taiwanese mangoes from sale to China. They've also continued their buildup of a system for unification. They've set up a sort of performance zone in Fujian province. And of course, what Douglas referred to, the interference, information wars, et cetera, et cetera. Finally, on the Douglas, I understand, was at the famous press conference about 2 weeks ago, where the opposition parties tried to combine forces. We would describe them generally as the anti-China parties. Nobody can be pro-China in Taiwan. That's an electoral disaster. And so since that happened, we've gone from 3 candidates to 2. It's the DPP versus the KMT. I don't think it's a sure thing, but you have to say at the moment the DPP is favored.
Thank you for that. And I'd love to, after this, once we go around, to hear more. You sort of sketched out what happens with DPP, but love to hear your thoughts on a post-election with the KMT win. What happens there? Now, you also spoke about the sort of alliances and the ties, and how China will put pressure elsewhere outside of Taiwan as well. And that brings me to Lavina. A lot of folks, including here in Australia, like to talk about strategic competition as sort of a bipolar fight between the US and China. But I think, in my view, and a lot of other people, that sort of removes the agency of a lot of nations who are also in the Indo-Pacific, including those in South Asia in particular. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how South Asia is viewing the upcoming election. Is it worried? Is Taiwan something that it really thinks about a lot? Obviously, everyone talks about a Taiwan contingency, but what does a Taiwan election mean to South Asia?
Well, I think when you think about the responses of Southeast Asian countries to the Taiwanese election, I think you should think about it in terms of how China has actually prepared the ground to effectively neutralize a lot of these Southeast Asian countries from taking any strong positions on Taiwan. So, you know, if you do a bit of research, there's not a real great depth to understanding or commentary about the election. But what I would say is that from a Southeast Asian perspective, they look at any prospect of conflict in our region as being a strategic disaster and something to be avoided at all costs. So from their perspective, they're looking at the election, as Richard has said, the prospect of a response by China to a DPP win is always in the back of everyone's mind, I think. And they will be very apprehensive about that, because for them, they are very clear they don't want to have to choose between the US and China. In terms of choosing, that is also taking a position on Taiwan. They would want the status quo to continue, to be able to trade, to be able to develop, to be able to develop links with Taiwan if they choose to. And I think a lot of Southeast Asian countries are trading more with Taiwan than they were previously. And I think that's to do with a lot of the work of the Taiwanese government to build those linkages. So for these countries, they would really like the present status quo to continue, but I can't say that any of them are going to take any strong positions either way. They haven't taken strong positions in the past when the Chinese have conducted very aggressive maneuvers around Taiwan after Nancy Pelosi's visit. You won't be able to see any Southeast Asian countries taking a very strong stand. So I think when you analyze it, it's really Australia and Japan as being the two countries in our region that are the most proactive, the most likely to, and in the past have made quite decisive statements about provocative and destabilizing behavior of China. And I think you can really only rely on Japan and Australia to take those kinds of responses. You also asked me to think about India as well, and I have thought about this myself because I do research on India, and I'm also I'm afraid I would have to say that India as well would not really want to be too involved in a Taiwan contingency. They view themselves as in an asymmetric relationship with China. They have a very fraught relationship, which probably most of you know. There is an ongoing border dispute that's very serious and still unresolved. And China has a lot of levers to dial up and dial down leverage over India. And I think India would, so far, has been quite cognizant of that possibility and really doesn't take any very firm statements on Taiwan. And I think that we don't want to speculate too much about conflict or the outbreak of conflict, but I think if such a thing were to occur, we can't really expect too much from India. India, in its relationship with the United States, I think it's a bit of a one-sided relationship. So they view the United States as being an important partner specifically to build their own capabilities. And they see it as what their role, or how they see it, is as a win-win for the United States, is that the more capable they become, the more they can oppose China in their own region. But I don't think they have an intention to get involved in the East Asian theatre.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mike, you went to Taiwan last year. You also managed a lot of the U.S. relationship with Taiwan when you worked in the White House. Could you give us the U.S. perspective on this? Also, you know, it's become we talk about the bipartisan consensus in the U.S. right now on China, but it also, in my view, has become, Taiwan's become a bit of a, you could say, a partisan tool for domestic politics in the U.S. as well. So could you give us maybe the U.S. perspective on the election?
Thanks, Jared, and it's great to have Douglas with us. Douglas spent, a decade working with the U.S. Congress from the Tech Row office in Washington. If you know about U.S. Taiwan policy, then you would know that the significant support the U.S. provides to Taiwan and security is not based on a treaty. It's based on the Taiwan Relations Act, on legislation. So the U.S. Congress, separate but equal branch of government, is incredibly important for Taiwan's survival, frankly. And Douglas was, for his sins, put in charge of that for a decade in two different iterations. So you have here in Australia one of Taiwan's finest diplomats. So the U.S. Right now on this election and on Taiwan policy, and the U.S. Congress, the think tank community, is actually very unified. It's interesting at a time of really hyper-partisanship that you all read about. When it comes to the Indo-Pacific broadly, but especially Taiwan, I've never seen such a high level of bipartisan support for Taipei and concern about what Beijing might do, generally, but especially after this election. You can see that manifest in legislation in particular. The U.S. has extended, the Congress has extended foreign military financing, which is a huge boost for Taiwan's defense needs. The U.S. Trade Representative's Office, USTR, which is frankly slow-rolling IPEF and other trade negotiations with Australia and Japan, definitely with Europe. The one area, frankly, maybe the only area where USTR is moving forward quickly is with Taiwan. in a new trade negotiation. And you've heard President Biden say, I think 4 times now, he's defend Taiwan. And the official US policy is unofficially called strategic ambiguity, meaning US officials don't say what we do in hypothetical because we don't want to encourage independence by Taipei. We don't want to encourage coercion by Beijing, just want to be ambiguous. President Biden 4 times has said, well, when asked, will I defend Taiwan? President Bush said it when I worked for him once in April 2002, and that's the only time. And he's frankly glad he said it. Joe Biden, in my view, is not saying this because he's out of touch. He's saying it because he thinks it needs to be said. And then he's letting his officials say, no, our policy hasn't changed. We still have a one China policy. But it gives you a sense of the strategic and political consensus that the US really has a stake in Taiwan's future. People broadly recognize what PRC coercion, embargo, blockade of Taiwan would mean for Japan, especially a key US ally, for Australia, for the Philippines. People know, recognize that Taiwan is in the front lines right now of defending democracy against foreign interference from social media, from cyber attacks. Audrey Tang, who's in charge of that in Taipei, is a world leader in how you defend democracy against foreign interference, teaching US, Japan, Australia, Canada, Europe how to do it. And then, Taiwan is the Ruhr Valley of the 21st century, the semiconductor industry. So there's, 10 years ago, you didn't hear people talking about Taiwan that way in Washington. And now everyone kind of does. They get how important Taiwan's future, Taiwan's democracy, the security of Taiwan in the first island chain is for the US. Big shout out to Xi Jinping for reminding us all of this. With all of the increased military, cyber, and other pressure on Taiwan. He certainly helped Tsai Ing-Wen in the last election with the crackdown on Hong Kong, and then a promise to Taiwan it could also receive the similar benefits. That's a big part of this. But frankly, a big part of it is Tsai Ing-Wen herself, who saw, when I was in the White House, when Chen Shui-bian was president, how President Chen's
Sorry, what party was Chen Shui-bian then from? Like, could you maybe
in
explain?
the DPP, same party.
Yeah.
But the first real opposition candidate to come in with no experience, very little international experience. That generation of DPP leaders was beaten, imprisoned. His vice president was in a wheelchair and had been beaten by the authorities. So these were sort of political leaders of the opposition in the 70s and 80s when it was physically dangerous. And there's a great picture of them all with their big long hair and bell-bottom jeans, but they weren't experienced in foreign affairs. They just weren't. And in particular, President Chen. So he really pushed Beijing's buttons. It played well for his base in what's called the Green Camp, the DPP and affiliated political forces. It played well, and he went too far. President Bush at one time publicly chastised him, which was not good. He got the message. President Tsai was head of the Mainland Affairs Council, deputy premier, saw all of this. The DPP leadership currently, Joseph Wu, the foreign minister, most of the senior leadership, David Lee, my very good friend who was in Washington, they clearly saw how dangerous it was for Taiwan that President Chen could lose a conservative Republican. Congress was divided, the think tanks were divided. That extended into President Tsai's first election campaign, where the Obama administration, the White House, you were there. In fact, it was the FT. You were probably.
I was that's right. The bureau chief of the FT, and I won't say who it came from, but we had a story saying the White House was not confident that President Tsai understood the sensitivities. And she blames that story for losing the 2012 election.
That was 2012, right? She lost the 2012 election. That's right. So it's your fault.
People have said that.
It's not Richard's fault, nor was it your colleague who did the interview.
Yeah.
I was in Washington, and saw Tsai when she came to Washington, the certain senior officials were being pushed by Beijing to get Tsai to agree to the 1992 consensus, and she wasn't drunk. But she wasn't going to agree to Beijing's interpretation. So it was a ham-handed play, in my view, by the Obama administration. They've since, frankly, they learned a lesson, but we're in a completely different place 10, 11 years later, where you'd be hard-pressed to find a congressional staffer or a think tank expert who doesn't think that Tsai Ing-Wen and the current government, including William Lai, are being pretty careful. Now, there are questions and have been questions about Lai because he is running for office. He had to win support within the Green camp. Parts of the pan-Green camp are still pretty pro-independence. You know, politics is politics. He skirted that one a little in ways that made Beijing very unhappy and some in Washington nervous. But I think on the campaign trail, he's been very disciplined, very careful. If and the KMT wins, to be quite candid, there's bipartisan support in Washington for Taiwan. And I think you can't win an election in Taiwan if you take on the US and Japan in particular. You could probably take on Australia, but you can't take on the US and Japan. And the KMT knows that when Ma Ying-jeou was in charge, he made the US and Japan a little bit nervous because the anti-China party has to be very careful not to be the anti-US party because that's an electoral loser. So in general, there's confidence about Taiwan going to election, but I've heard the same thing from Chinese interlocutors. Richard said there is an expectation, particularly if Lai wins, but perhaps even if one of the other candidates wins, that Beijing will increase military pressure to send a signal, and the US will respond proportionately and carefully. And this will be an important moment for Japan and Australia as well.
Thanks, Mike. So I flagged this earlier, and Mike talked about how disciplined DPP candidates have been. I think what was the quote that Lai said? He's self-identified as a political worker for Taiwan independence, and he's changed his tune and moderated himself a bit. And he also has chosen a vice president who's seen as a trusted pair of hands as well. But what if they don't win? What is a KMT win look like for cross-strait relations and how Beijing perceives it? I mean, we've heard that no matter who wins, there's going to be some significant military pressure by Beijing. But is it dramatically so with a DPP win, or is it maybe less so to sort of induce better behavior or more compliant behavior, perhaps, from a KMT presidency?
Yeah, well, there's different dynamics at play, and I'll just talk about them a little bit. As Mike said, the China often blames the US for fomenting independence in Taiwan. In fact, what happens is the US reads the Riot Act to whoever is the candidate not to support independence because they know that would cause military conflict. Now, in the case of the DPP, the KMT, it's interesting. First of all, the KMT's done better than people thought in this election campaign in recent weeks, and that's because of their choice, I think, of the vice president. The KMT candidate actually is not trusted by grassroots KMT people, the sort of Taipei elite, as it's described to me. He's considered light blue, as opposed to sort of dark blue. But his choice of vice president was quite clever, I think. He chose a dark blue candidate, somebody who's very much a sort of in favor of unification. And so he's managed to unify the KMT base and perhaps give the party a fighting chance. So what would happen? First of all, you cannot be pro-China to pro-CCP, I should say, to win a Taiwan election. So the current KMT candidate has refused to sign on to, here we go again, the 1992 consensus before or after dinner. All he says he respects his predecessor's fact that he did sign on to it, Ma Ying-jeou, the previous KMT president. So China's not happy about that. They'll want a much more assertive statement from him. Having said that, I think, if the KMT wins, there will be more carrots. China will restart talks. I can remember during the final years of the last KMT government visiting Taiwan and the various Taiwan Affairs Office, Mainland Affairs Council, the two groups on either side of the strait, they were sort of texting and talking daily. They had a lot of contact, which obviously disappeared with the DPP. So I think there'll be an attempt at more, China's hopeless at seduction, but maybe they'll try a bit of that. They'll probably lift some of the trade embargoes. They'll increase people-to-people contact. They will want to have more official delegations coming and going from China and Taiwan. But I don't think they will, there's no easing off generally for China and their sort of fundamental aim on unification. So the military exercises will continue, the military encirclement and strangulation, if you like, strangulation. I think that will not, and that will never go away. But I think there will be an easing of tensions, relatively speaking, if the KMT does win.
Now, you mentioned before, Lavina, on the status quo and how Southeast Asia really does not want to change the status quo, but there's no denying that China wants to change the status quo, and it's used a number of means to do that, including gray zone coercion. But with that said, typical with sort of rising powers, there's allies and partnerships are building within the region, and we're seeing, it feels like every week, a new sort of joint access agreement between different militaries, especially with the US and Australia in the region. Australia and the Philippines, just was it this week, was Australia and France. Do you see that as Southeast Asia really starting to, in particular Southeast Asia, really starting to have some more views on Taiwan in particular? There's some polling on this that views have changed, but do you think that when the rubber hits the road, that Southeast Asia is where it was maybe 10 years ago, or I should say 15 years ago, pre Xi Jinping, or have things changed and the status quo is changing?
Well, I think there's only really one Southeast Asian country that potentially will be reliable in a potential contingency in Taiwan, and that's the Philippines. So all of you have probably heard of the opening up of 4 new bases to US access in the Philippines this year under the new President Marcos, which was certainly not predicted. And I was in the Philippines just before the election and asking Filipino scholars, what do you think his foreign policy would be? And none of them would have said to me that this was something on the cards. So obviously, I think, as you said earlier, President Xi is kind of the gift that keeps on giving. He doesn't seem to know how to charm, as you say.
Hopeless.
There's only one direction, and in terms of Taiwan, they used to have a soft, hard approach to Taiwan in the first term of the Tsai government, and then it's now only coercive. I think in terms of the Philippines, even then with the Philippines, it's still quite uncertain what the Philippines will actually do in a Taiwanese contingency. So we can't overplay it. It sends certain signals. It certainly complicates Chinese thinking about what the Philippines might do. But the Philippines have been quite reticent to actually say, yes, we will allow those bases to be used by the US for a Taiwanese contingency. But the proximity of the Philippines is just so close to Taiwan that you almost think it would be almost impossible for them to be not involved and not be tapped on the shoulder in some way. In terms of the rest of Southeast Asia, I think China's been working on this strategy for 10 years, accelerated after the BRI. It's all about neutralizing the Southeast Asian countries. And I think they've been quite successful in neutralizing. When I say neutralizing, I mean, while China changes the status quo, it's the one changing the status quo. It's the one revising, pushing the boundaries. All it needs is for as many countries in our region to basically not get involved, for that to be a problem for the United States to project power. So the United States needs other countries to be proactive. They need to be willing to help the United States to be in this region and to defend the rules-based order. So as many of those Southeast Asian countries, if they remain out of the fray, that's a good thing for China. In terms of, I hate to kind of introduce a slightly negative note to things. You are correct to say that there is a broader strategic alignment, I think, between a lot of countries in our region, primarily because of Chinese behavior. So as you say, there's announcements about AUKUS this year, progress with France, a lot of trilateral, bilateral progression on military and security, which is all good. And if you look at our DSR, for example, our Defence Strategic Review, you will see a definite strategic alignment and thinking about the prospects of conflict and where they arise and how. You'll also see, say, with Japan and Australia, a commonality in terms of that urgency to build deterrence by denial capabilities. But at this stage, it's all in declaratory policy, and it's not actually in reality. And I think that's the problem for all of the countries in the region that want to be proactive, that think that Taiwan's choices should be Taiwan's choices of its future, or for their own self-interested reasons just want to prevent war and conflict, is that we really haven't done enough. We talk a lot about urgency, but it takes a lot for democracies, I think, to act urgently when it comes to defense and security and spending more money on defense. And that's a common problem, I think, between Australia, Japan, even Taiwan, for example, where there really has to be a lot of urgency about what all of us are doing. And I think there are moves in that direction, but we're still extremely unprepared.
Yeah, I was just thinking, what do democracies move fast on? And I think we saw in Taiwan, as well as the Republican Congressional Caucus, they move fast in having a press conference, but not really knowing what they're going to say at the press conference. Speaking of Republicans, you worked in the Bush administration, Mike, and one thing that I think that the Chinese like to do, and they did in the Bush administration as well, is that they like to test new administrations. They do an early test. So in the Bush administration, they had the EP3 incident. Do you think that is something that we are in the Australia and the US and Taiwan? Is that something that they are talking about with a new administration in Taiwan? Richard talked about what both a KMT and TPP outcomes could look like, but do you think that the US and especially Australia how are they viewing this new administration? How are they preparing for it? What would you recommend, given your expertise in managing, being an alliance manager and being a manager with the relationship with Taiwan?
What would I recommend for Taiwan?
For Taiwan, but also for
Beijing?
managing Beijing, and for managing like what Beijing's reaction to the how Beijing has reacted in the past and how Beijing may react with this new president taking over.
So the EP3 incident, which was when a U.S. patrol plane, propeller plane was hit by a J-8 Chinese PLA Air Force fighter in April 2001, was an accident. It was not, I mean, we didn't feel in the administration, some argue this, but it wasn't seen as a deliberate test. What it did show was that the People's Liberation Army will do what it's going to do regardless of international politics or diplomacy. And you can see that right now with Australia, where the Prime Minister had a summit, but the PLA just kept doing what it does and pinged Royal Australian Navy divers and so forth. So that was 20 some years ago, but I think we all who follow the PLA don't see the PLA testing so much as just doing what they think they need to do to assert their claims and to create tension and pressure on countries or militaries that are in the way. Friction. They produce friction. Yeah, the Foreign Ministry in the summit with Joe Biden, with Prime Minister Albanese, the Foreign Ministry, Xi Jinping himself even will try to produce results, but the PLA produces friction. That's what they do, and it doesn't change with the new presidency. So I actually don't expect with a new US president that the PLA will significantly turn down what it does or significantly turn up the test. It will just keep as it is, incrementally increasing the pressure, especially on Taiwan, but on Indonesia, on the Philippines, Japan, India, you name it. You know, it's a sort of a, I was in Washington last week and talking to some of Richard's friends in the China world, Lavina's there too. It's sort of a drinking game for people who can't do the 92 consensus. The next one is, so does Xi Jinping want Trump or Biden? And Chinese leaders like predictability. Mao famously said after meeting Nixon, I like rightists, they're very predictable. More than ideology, they want predictability. Biden's more predictable. On the other hand, Joe Biden's pretty steady on alliances, on Taiwan, on Europe, and that's inconvenient for China's strategy. Donald Trump's unpredictable. I personally don't think it's, you know, it's Joe Biden's to lose. But if Donald Trump becomes the candidate, he still has to do that, and then were to become president, I think Beijing would look at it, and Richard should jump in and think, this guy is unpredictable. That's not good. And even though many of the ones who served in the previous Trump administration wouldn't come back, a Trump national security team will be the right wing of the Republican Party. It will be the most hawkish anti-China defense academics and think tankers. So that's not good from China's perspective. And Republicans almost always spend more on defense too. So it's mixed, you know. Beijing tried to play Donald Trump the first time, directly through his company to the White House to try to get certain things. It didn't work. So my guess is on balance, like our Southeast Asian friends, Beijing can't decide, doesn't want to choose, but I'd be interested in Richard's take.
Well, you know, I broaden a little bit. I think generally speaking, the 10, 20 years ago, I would have thought the US is a predictable power. I think these days, China is a predictable power. We know what they want, but I think the US is more unpredictable.
So 20 years ago, the US was more predictable.
Yes, I think so. I
That's the
think
Iraq
these
War
days,
invasion.
post-Iraq war, you know, these much more politics, much more internal, the Trumpification of the Republican Party. I think the US is more unpredictable, generally speaking. First of all, on Trump, you know, I'm no fan of Trump, but I think when Trump first came in, as Mike says, the Chinese thought, oh, we can manage this guy and it's going to be great for us. You know, there's a moment of hubris, I think, for the Chinese political system. They said, yes, America, you lecture us about democracy. Look at this clown you've elected, you know, whereas we choose smart people to run our government. But I think, Trump's chief of staff didn't know what he was going to do. And so China didn't know what he was going to do. So I think in the end, Trump kind of destabilized Beijing a little bit and gained quite a bit of traction in that respect. And I think the Biden team has professionally built on that. But I think that, so the point being, I think generally speaking, you know, Trump's unpredictability can work, but I think it's corrosive over time to the US system. Makes it less internationalized country. It's corrosive for alliances. We'll all start to look elsewhere once again, even though there's not really anywhere to look. So in that respect, I think, you know, I don't know what China thinks, to be honest, who does, but I think that the election of Trump is better for China overall than the election of Biden. Is that the question?
Yeah.
I think the other point I want to make, I've got just very briefly on status quo. A lot of people say we're defending the status. Oh, no, I'll start with this bit. One China, there's lots of fictions we use to manage the relationship. One of the big debates, Mike and Lavina might have views on this. A lot of Republicans want to ditch the one China policy. They think it's redundant. They think we just should, and if you ditch the one China policy, that's essentially support for Taiwan independence. And I think the one China policy, as farcical as it can seem, gives us a lot of wiggle room. And I think that's a big danger coming out of the US and a Trump election.
Yeah, maybe we can go on the one China policy. Just quickly to Mike, do you see that as changing with the Trump election?
No. However, if you have a new administration coming in, which includes so people who served in the previous Trump administration who didn't resign after the January assault on the Capitol generally don't want to go back in. It was really, really hard. So you're gonna have a group of less experienced, very conservative, very anti-China people in different key posts. And they will say things, quite sure of it. And some of them will say we should get rid of strategic ambiguity, we should get rid of the one China policy. But that's not where the Congress is as a whole. So you couldn't legislate it. And it's ultimately not where Donald Trump is for all his flaws. He doesn't really want a war with China over Taiwan. So there will be a lot of uncertainty and noise potentially, but I think in the end, the US policy doesn't change. Similarly, if you get the KMT coming in Taipei, they've been out of office for 8 years. It's a very different party from Ma Ying-jeou's party. You know, they skirt this line politically. So politically, they're incentivized to say the US won't help Taiwan, therefore Tsai Ing-Wen has failed, therefore Lai will fail. That comes very close to sort of attacking US alliance, and the KMT doesn't go that far. But it does raise questions in Washington about, are these guys serious? You'll have new people coming in, moving from campaigning to governing. Some people don't get the memo and keep using the political points instead of the governing points. So yeah, if you have a change of government in Taipei or Washington, there will be some big headlines. Richard will have a blast. There will be big headlines, probably, but it will settle. Because the consensus overwhelmingly in Taiwan is not, it's the status quo basically, and heavy recognition of the importance of the US and Japan, and the status quo or the consensus in the US is pretty strong ultimately as well.
A lot of folks have talked about stabilization. We saw the bilat between Xi and Biden, as well as Xi and Albanese. But I think, you know, it's been a little while since Australia had a bilat before then. And I think a lot of folks would say that maybe Beijing's strategy is the same, but their tactics have changed slightly. You mentioned earlier, Lavina, that you were in the Philippines and you only saw public opinion, or you only saw them heading one way in Southeast Asia in many ways. But do you think that the sort of, I don't know how you say it, the somewhat muted wolf warrior diplomacy, maybe not as aggressive wolf warrior diplomacy, is having an impact in Southeast Asia? It's been, I don't know how, when you can put the starting date on that, but there is, you know, for the past few months at least, a change in sort of tact from Beijing. Do you see that having any impact?
I wouldn't say immediately so. No, I mean, as I said to you before, most of the countries in Southeast Asia, they are heavily trading with China. Their number one priority every time I do any kind of dialogue with Southeast Asians, and we talk about US, China, and the United States in particular, they say China understands our development needs. The United States is vacant in the field on trade and on infrastructure. Some of that is actually not true. It's just that China has a better branding. It has a big picture state-run package, the BRI, which you can say, yes, this is what we do. Whereas the United States, it's all private sector led. And yes, it's actually extremely important in terms of investment in the region, but it's unable to sell that story in, you know, kind of collective sense in the same way. And I think there's this competing duality in Southeast Asia that on the one hand, as it's been mentioned already, you've got the PLA unrelenting and in fact increasing the level of aggression shown towards other Southeast Asian claimant states. The level of military incursions into Taiwanese airspace, seas across the median line. They're doing it all the time to the extent where they're normalizing it so that almost we forget about it happening.
Yep.
And you could say the same thing in the South China Sea. Very aggressive blocking of fishing, of exploration. All of this continues and in fact has escalated. So if you were to see the duality there, they see what China does. And I think they can separate what China says from what China does. At the same time, their primary problem is that they need development. And so for many of them, China is the the more reliable partner when it comes to economic development, and they're not going to say no. They're not going to say no to that.
Except, all true.
Yeah.
Except that there's an even more reliable partner than China, and that's Japan. Which
In
in
Southeast Asia in
infrastructure
particular.
financing performs quantitatively and qualitatively what China does. And in public opinion is off the charts, like well above China, but also the US, Australia, and Korea. So, and Japan, of course, is the very close ally of the US. So that's why your point's so important to think about this competition. And I know Lamita knows this, writes this, but just wanted to add this. It's a multipolar thing.
Yeah.
And the US needs to step up its game in Southeast Asia. But if it were just the US, we'd be in big trouble. It's not. It's a much more complicated scrum.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big question, in the way I try and think of it, is the post-American world in Southeast Asia Sinocentric? And the answer is not necessarily. I'll qualify, I slightly disagree with what Mike's sense that I think overall in amounts of committed money and actual spent money in terms of official aid and loans, China is slightly ahead. But China has given, you have the impression they dominate entire Southeast Asia. In fact, China is only dominant in 3 countries, Cambodia, Laos, and Indonesia. And if you look at all the other countries and institutions, the Asia Development Bank, the World Bank, Japan, South Korea, very important, Australia as a lender, not an investor, sadly. We're trying to fix that over time. There's multiple players in the region, and it's not just China. And don't forget that the BRI in the old form is basically dead. China has running out of fiscal space. They're not going to be spraying money around like they used to. They can't afford it. There's a big backlash inside China against that. So it's, the region is not dominated by China, and it won't be if others continue to be active.
Mike, did you want to?
No, I was just gonna say, it depends on how you count. We can take this offline, but Japan is the second largest player in World Bank, co-equal in the World Bank, excuse me, the Asia Development Bank, plus the infrastructure finance from JBIC. It's a lot, and importantly, it's high quality. It's sustainable. There are no debt traps and so on and so forth. There's a big debate about whether there are debt traps, but it certainly is sustainable in terms of the environment, community engagement, and especially fiscal responsibility.
It also, I think, maybe gets to Lavina's point, though, is that might be factually true, but in terms of public opinion and their perception, well, you've done some polling on this.
Japan doesn't bribe leaders.
Yeah.
So it's not a completely fair playing field.
Yeah.
And Japan is not, I have to look at public opinion polls or read reports by American and Australian think tanks to realize it, because Japan's not always the best at selling its own story.
Exactly.
And that may be part of their success, actually.
And I think that goes back to the point that it's actually about strategic narratives, and the good work that Japan does in our region. It's actually about selling that in a more obvious way, and the way that I think also there's a lot of work to be done anyway, between allies, between Japan, Australia. The European Union is a big player. The United States is a big player, for us to combine and collaborate more effectively in terms of infrastructure and development to sell a story. So if you look at just ODA, if you combined all the ODA of all the G7 countries, we give more than China, but I'm not sure whether that really is apparent. That message is sold, and most of the ODA that China gives is not actually ODA. It's concessional loans.
Even
So
non-concessional.
Non-concessional and concessional. So, you're really not selling the story because Japanese, European, American, Australian ODA is ODA. It is what it says it is. So it is about that battle of narratives and playing
Taiwan,
that.
I should mention.
I was
Taiwan.
about to say Taiwan and
The
Pacific.
countries.
Yep.
Diplomatic relations with Taiwan, and they're important in the current geopolitical context. So Taiwan's part of this game as well, on the right side.
Yes, and
It hasn't always been on the
yeah.
right side in terms of the nature of economic assistance, but
Yeah.
I think under the Tsai government is really working with Australia, the US, Japan, to make sure the development assistance is, consistent with the OECD.
Above board.
Above
Above
board.
board.
Yeah.
There you go.
And we
That's a
should be
nice
doing
term.
more with them in the Pacific,
Australia should do more.
definitely.
That actually brings me
Yeah.
to one of my final questions before we open up to the audience. Australia's perception of Taiwan amidst this new relationship with China. You are all either citizens or permanent residents of Australia. You can just go down the line and get your thoughts on what you think Australia, how it's perceiving this election or perceiving Taiwan more broadly, and perhaps what you think how Australia should be perceiving Taiwan.
Yeah, well, I'll just be very brief. I went to the dentist the other day and I said, yes, I'm off to Taiwan tomorrow. And he said, oh, before it's taken over. And I thought that was probably not untypical, really. There's probably a sense of inevitability about it. Now, that's obviously the worst kind of anecdata that I've given you there. But I did feel that sort of said something to me. I think most people, China's very good at gaslighting on the one China policy. In other words, many people, even senior people in Australia, say, well, we agree that Taiwan's part of China, and it's just a matter of negotiating terms, and that's a fundamental misunderstanding as well. In terms of, the urgency issue, as Lavina said, it's very hard for democracies to get worked up until they've got a crisis staring them in the face. I think it's for Taiwan, it's really the politics, the slow grinding through hard boards that the likes of Douglas have to do to gradually lift. People have got a lot of things going on in their life. They want to watch MasterChef and everything like that, and to sort of lift the salience of and awareness of Taiwan is a long, hard slog.
Glad you mentioned MasterChef, because as proudly American as I am, the Australian MasterChef is significantly better than the American version. Lavina.
I've been to Taiwan a couple of times this year. One at the invitation of Taiwan, the Taiwanese government. So thanks to them for that. I would say, just from my own perspective, I think in Australia we don't know enough about Taiwan. So we see Taiwan in terms of potential conflict, but ordinary Australians don't understand enough about just the commonalities that we have between Australia and Taiwan. Douglas, what you said in your address, I had that feeling when I went to Taiwan about when you talked about how precious democracy is in Taiwan. I think in Australia, we take it for granted. I know when I grew up here and went to school, I didn't learn a lot about our democracy and the nuts and bolts of it and why it was important, because it was just part of our country and the way we are. But when you've had to fight for it and you've had to build it from the ground up and to build such a strong, robust democracy in such a short period of time, it's actually extremely remarkable. And I think when I say it's important that Australians start thinking about Taiwan as just ordinary people like us, it's about thinking about, that they're not just players on a chessboard, and that the wishes of the Taiwanese people should be respected. So even if we see a KMT government, and we anticipate, because the Chinese would actually like a KMT government, that relations might be a little bit better for a short period of time. I'm of the view that's all very short term, that President Xi is not getting any younger. He's 70 years old. He's tied his legacy to reunification. So I think he will do what he needs to do. But I think it's about, doing what we can to deter China from taking that action, and for the Taiwanese people for their wishes to be respected.
And Mike, I think few people in this room have been, or few people in the world, I should say, have been in more discussions about that deterrence. And so any thoughts as well, Australia and Taiwan, but also the deterrence efforts that the US and Australia have been engaging in?
So I guess the first thing I'd say is I look at the Australian public's response to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and it gives me a lot of confidence about ultimately where Australia would be if there was pressure on Taiwan or coercion or war. And our own surveys show, and you did them, so correct me if I'm wrong, but about half of Australians say that if the US decided to defend Taiwan in a crisis, that Australia should go in too, which is about 3-1 over those opposed. And which, by the way, is about the same as the number of Americans who say, should we defend Taiwan? It's about half or a little over half now.
Australians are slightly more, more in
Sometimes,
favor than
depends on the poll.
Americans. Yeah.
So at a sort of basic level, just not talking about Taiwan specifically, when a democracy is brutally attacked, my sense is you look at the Ukraine case, the Australian public won't tolerate that. On the other hand, you know, I've been living here a year and 4 months, and I read the Sydney Morning Herald and the Australian and the Financial Review and stuff every morning. And after I sort of stopped panicking about the stories about housing prices and private school prices and other things that affect my life, check the weather and beach report, I am struck that the general narrative media, Richard and Lavina, important exceptions, the general sort of media narrative about Taiwan, I'm making this up, but I guess it's 90–95% commentary, where somebody is writing a piece or being quoted saying, why would we go to war over Taiwan? I'm told there's another one of these coming from a former politician in tomorrow's AFR. So 90% of what you read about Taiwan is, why would we go to war for America to defend Taiwan? I can't think of an article I've seen about Taiwan's democracy, about Taiwan's, you know, excellent food scene or whatever. I'm glad to hear that, you know, Lavina, some of our young colleagues from USSC, from Lowy, ASPE, from universities, there's a much higher tempo of younger sort of rising stars going to Taiwan, learning more. I think that's really important because there is that disconnect right now. But at the end of the day, Richard Marles, you know, said something like, I'll get it wrong, you know, if something happens to Taiwan, Australia is not the kind of country that's just going to be a passive observer. You know, the diplomacy with China has made others in the government a lot more careful than that. But I think Australians ultimately understand what's at stake, even if the papers aren't sort of giving the full, you know, range of views.
Can I just very quickly?
You're going to defend the Australian press?
No, I'm not doing that. Lavina made an interesting point about they tend to think about Taiwan in terms of war. And Peter Dutton, when he was defense minister, he talked about twice, I think, talked about how Australia couldn't see us standing by if war broke out. He was heavily criticized for that. I might have criticized him myself for that. But if you flip it, there's an alternative argument. How do you get people's attention? And I think Pentagon generals have struggled with this as well. They've talked about war, and I think they've been told to shut up. So it's really difficult to find the right way to talk about Taiwan. I've been part of a study group looking at exactly this. We've got a report coming soon to try and lift Taiwan's sort of profile without always resorting to just talking about war, as possible as that is.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And I'll just do a quick ad and say, I'm actually going to be interviewing Douglas after this. So, and on a podcast that you can hear in a few days from now, so you can hear a bit more about non-military issues involving Taiwan. So with that, I'll open to questions from the floor. If I could ask, per usual at the study center, not a diatribe, not commentary, but a question, just name and affiliation. If you can just raise your hand, and then we'll bring a microphone to you. Do we have anyone right over here in the red?
Oh, hi, my name's Peter Trusham, and I'm not affiliated. I'm just independent. I found the last conversation very interesting and very meaningful. But as an Australian, I'm listening to the media, and I'm getting from the government, I'm getting two messages. One is that, we have to, in a way, trade with China. We have to talk with them, or especially under Xi Jinping. And the other message is from maybe the defense minister that, well, you know, we have to be prepared to deter China. So I'm getting like two messages, and they don't really, they don't mix. So my question is, does the government need to come, you know, be more honest with the Australian people and tell us where we stand and what we're going to do, and lay it out? Do we need to value our democracy? We never fought for our democracy like Taiwan did.
It's always the unaffiliated folks who have the best ideas and questions. Excellent question. I think
Can't be fired.
exactly. I think everyone here probably has a thought on that. If we want to just go down the line, you want to take a crack first, Richard?
Well, there's no contradiction between trading with China and also, you know, deterring China, protecting our national interests. I frankly think that we should be much better in Australia at talking out of both sides of our mouth. Everybody else does it. And frankly, one of the great ironies, and this certainly applies to Japan as well, is in a way to deter China, we need to trade with China. I mean, it's a tremendous value to Australia, not just in terms of jobs, but really in terms of, you know, tax revenues, actually, the mining companies. And that's our leverage, I think. One of the interesting lessons, and I won't go on much longer, lessons about this was of China's series of punitive trade measures against us, is that both sides tried to diversify, both sides failed. In other words, trade blossomed, even though large chunks of trade were wiped out. Now, that's not very good if you're a wine grower in the Barossa, but you know, we have our leverage as well. We should exploit that. And at the same time, we should be cognizant and act on, you know, of what's happening and act on it. And to think you can cut one from the other, I think is wrong.
I think, Richard, I agree with Richard in that I don't think there's any country that's actually said, okay, we're not trading with China. We might be simultaneously building up a deterrence capabilities, but we're also going to stop trading with China. About the problem.
Yeah.
So, okay, from my perspective, this last year, the Australian government has been very, very one-track minded about getting a meeting with President Xi. And I think that in order to get this meeting, the Australian government actually has given up quite a lot for this idea of stabilisation. So from my perspective, giving up WTO cases on wine and barley that you were going to win, that other countries had joined on as third parties to make a point about the WTO system, about the importance of standing up to economic coercion. All of those things were kind of lost opportunities that were given up on the basis that we need to talk to one another. I'm not saying that it's not a good thing that Australia and China have now a diplomatic dialogue that is open, but there's no point in having a dialogue if you can't say serious things and you can't actually advocate for the national interest. I was also a little bit worried about the fact that when Albanese went to China, he also headed a trade delegation of 200 odd Australian businesses. I think that sends probably the wrong signal. Not a good signal in terms of there's been a lot of work done in Australia to get the business community to understand that they need to diversify their markets for their goods, that it's important for Australia to also to ensure that we have a resilient economy, that we're not exposed to the potential for economic coercion. And yes, we have weathered this 2 years worth of economic coercion very well. But that's because China needs the products that we sell. The major products that we sell, they need it, they want it. And they didn't sanction that. They sanctioned things that they didn't need so much. So in terms of, do I think that the Australian government should be honest? I think they should. And I do worry that going forward, what is the price that the government is willing to pay for stabilising relations? Will that mean that they aren't honest? in order to keep those channels open. I don't think that that's the point of actually reestablishing diplomatic conversations.
I agree with both Lavina and Richard. The one way to think of this problem is China's increasing coercion, embargoes, military coercion, interference was sort of like a big rock that fell in a pond and it hit Japan first. And then it kind of hit the US and it washed up on Australia more recently.
South Korea.
And
Yeah,
South Korea, well, South Korea was so close that it washed by and it bounced back. And so geography actually, it's not just the trading relationship, which explains its geography. Australia is far away, less of a sense of urgency. Historically, Australia's defense planning was based on 10 years of warning time, meaning that if some countries suddenly threaten Australia, there'd be 10 years to procure the kit and get ready. 2 years ago, in the defense update, and then in the defense strategic review, that was essentially taken out. There is no warning time. The challenge is here now. And there was an urgency to the defense strategic review and an honesty that was impressive and important, and it dissipated. The politicians weren't comfortable talking about it. But I do think that was a moment that was important and that honesty is going to be necessary frankly, to win support for a lot of policies, including trade and engagement with China. You know, when Japan was hit with this a decade plus ago, when the US was really 2015, I think Australia was probably 2017, 18, 19 that started. Japan and then the US really struggled. You know, the Japanese Prime Minister in 2009, Yuko Hatama, announced that he wanted an East Asian community with China. And then the Chinese embargoed exports to Japan, you know, rammed a Japanese Coast Guard boat near the contested Senkaku Islands, and so forth. And then you never heard that again. The Obama administration, you know, endorsed this idea of strategic reassurance and gave a kind of nod, not complete endorsement, but a nod to Xi Jinping's proposal in 2013 for a new model of great power relations, where the US and China would settle our differences and get along, and settle our differences by not defending Japan, not selling arms to Taiwan, you know, basically selling on our allies. And the Obama administration was divided, frankly, 7, 8 years ago. So I guess I would say in defense of the Australian debate, US and Japan struggled a lot. The US is still struggling about how to articulate this. Are we friends and enemies? Are we frenemies? Is it containment and engagement, contagion? You know, people are constantly trying to come up with words. It's totally contradictory, but it's the world we live in. And I think it is important to be honest, and it is possible to be honest and also build a productive relationship with China, welcome students, work if you can. China's making it hard on climate change. Look to a future where maybe friction is down, cooperation's up. Right now we're in the world of friction, and the Chinese strategy is to produce friction to get countries to back off and do what they want. And I think if the government's really honest, it will say, look, there's friction and there will continue to be friction. Our goal is not to get rid of friction, it's to manage this and stand up for values and interests. And I think, you know, I think that's coming, frankly, as an observer of how other countries have dealt with this clumsily in the past.
Can I just quickly ask, Mike, as someone who wrote a book on Shinzo Abe, do you think that Japan maybe provided some sort of model being in terms of how to manage both economic relations and standing up to China in the defense areas?
If I say yes, it will sell books. So yes, I published a book a year and a half ago. It's in Japanese now as well, if you want to read it in Japanese, looking at Abe's foreign policy strategy and management of China. Abe really did, with this idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific, that maritime democracy should band together, show the way. You know, Trump had no foreign policy in Asia. The Japanese government briefed his people, and then his Secretary of State announced our policy is a free and open Indo-Pacific, which was, you know, literally like plagiarized from Japan's foreign ministry. The Korean government has come out with an Indo-Pacific strategy. The Defense Strategic Review is clearly predicated on that. So Japan's influence was really big. But the point I point out was it was not just about confronting China. It was about taking away the incentives for China to bully, and then trying to get the relationship on a path that would be productive for everyone. And even the most hawkish Japanese politicians in the ruling party put out a document a year ago that said we're going to have standoff strike weapons, Tomahawk missiles. We're going to increase the defense budget, almost double it to 2%. We're going to stand up for democracy and human rights. All Beijing loved that. But it predicated the whole thing. The first paragraph said, our goal is to get to a productive relationship with China. So kind of like what Richard, you need to be able to talk out of both sides of your mouth if that's your goal. Yeah.
Excellent. Another question from the audience, if you want to raise your hand. Have one from a media outlet.
Hi, my name is Hui. I'm from the Central News Agency, Taiwan, and I have a question for Dr. Green. And we noticed that some American experts suggest that if Lai Ching-te is elected, he should freeze the DPP's Taiwan independence platform. And so my question is that, in your opinion, what might be the reason behind such voice emerging in the United States? And has there been a shift in how the US political or economic circles perceive Taiwan? Thank you.
Well, the first thing I'd say is if you look at the Republican or Democratic Party platforms, there's some weird stuff in there. Or even the ruling LDP. Party platforms are not foreign policy. They're political aspirations. They're produced by political activists, often at the grassroots level. Would the US, Japan, Australia be reassured if Lai Ching-te got elected and said, I'm going to freeze that from our party platform, historical party platform? Probably. However, he's not going to do it. Taiwan's a democracy, and there are things in the Republican and Democratic policy platforms and the LDP, probably this recent Labor Congress, what is it?
Conference.
Conference.
There are things that came out of that will never be Australian foreign policy. I'm not too fussed about it. I don't think the vast majority of US officials are pressing or expecting Lai Ching-te to do anything like that. That, by the way, was one of the really important evolutions in American thinking about Taiwan. I think too often in the past, senior officials looking to stabilize relations with China saw Taiwan as an independent variable that you had to control, sort of ignoring the fact that Taiwan is a robust democracy. And sometimes officials ask Taiwan to do things that we would never do in our democracies. And I think now there's an understanding that democracy itself is incredibly valuable, especially after Hong Kong, especially after Taiwan stood up to foreign interference. I think, to the gentleman's earlier question, I think there's a growing recognition, wait a minute, that respecting Taiwan's democratic process and democracy is itself really, really important. Taiwan's not just sort of this free variable in US-China or Australia-China relations. And I hope your task force.
Well, yeah, no, I think if Mr. Lai did that, he might lose a lot of support in the DPP and he'd be a totally ineffective president, actually. So I think it wouldn't be a very smart idea. He has to sort of balance the dark greens and the light greens, just a fact of life.
You can still find some China experts in the US who take the view that, that Taipei should sign on to Beijing's version of the 1992 consensus and do whatever it takes to stabilize relations. But it has become a very, very, very small minority of the expert community. And I don't know of anyone in Congress who has that view. Yeah.
I can't think of anyone. Last question. Go right here. We'll make it brief because we only have a couple minutes left.
Okay. Recently, there's been two seminars. One conducted by the Hoover Institute.
Like Uber the car?
Hoover.
Hoover. Sorry.
At Stanford, yeah.
Like the vacuum.
If Uber's giving money to think tanks, I want it.
Yeah,
Well,
Dan Blumenthal and I don't think his name, Elbridge Colby,
Yeah.
under Peter Robinson, and your old alma mater, CSIS. Bunny Lin convened one with perhaps one of your ex-FT colleagues, and 2 or 3 other people. Highly detailed, very interesting, and lots of food for thought. So I'd recommend those 2 for people to watch as a counter view. Full disclosure, I was a student at ANU. 40 years ago, I went to study in Taiwan. When I was a student there, it was still under military dictatorship under Chiang Kai-shek, and the KMT were basically moving towards democracy. The KMT standard policy was that they would reunify China under the 3 principles of the people, etc., etc. Fast forward 40 years, it's radically different. Now we've pursued the framework of all the countries that deal with China of a one China policy. But the old ruling elite, which were Baishanren, or people who had migrated from the mainland, have now basically disappeared. Their political influence is gone, and you now have completely new native Taiwanese / Chinese, with the distinction you were making before. How do they, looking back over 40 years and going forward another 20, how does that dynamic work without impinging upon a one China policy and the CCP feeling threatened?
I just said, as a pollster, last poll I saw on this was 2.3% of Taiwanese citizens only identified as Chinese. So.
Well, that is the, sorry, my stomach is rumbling. I hope the microphone is not picking that up. Yes, I think when I first went to Taiwan, and if I get this right, Douglas, you can correct me, Taiwan still had the representatives in the National Assembly for Chinese provinces. The member for Hubei, the member for sort of Anhui, they still ruled, and some of them lived in California, I understand. And, you know, they were the sort of old bandits of the new kind. So I think what you say is basically that is China's problem. People don't identify with China. I think young people in Taiwan, they think, do you want to unify with China? And say, why would we do that? What's in it for us? And this goes back a long way. Li Dongwei, of course, who broke the mold. China says, well, you should love the motherland. He never went to the motherland except as a Japanese, on a Japanese troop ship once. And he spoke Japanese better than he did Chinese. So people in Taiwan, yes, but he was proud of that.
Yeah.
But you know, I think, you know, that's the key point. People don't identify as Chinese, and the longer that's gone on, the more that's been the case. And so the only way for unification is through forceful means. And so that's why Taiwan is going to be a big issue for many years to come.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Richard, Lavina, and Mike, for an excellent discussion. And thank you, Douglas, for this fantastic opening remarks. Please stay tuned to the U.S. Studies Center's website, usc.edu.au, and you can see both the recording of this as well as future events. And otherwise, I hope everyone has a lovely night and fantastic summer break.